Hello and welcome back to ADHD Confidence Club Q&A week 2. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about imposter syndrome because we didn't get to talk about that in this session. Imposter syndrome is much more frequent for people with ADHD, mainly because of executive function issues. So if you can't remember the things that have gone well, and also you have executive function issues with things like planning and organisation, emotional regulation, this all feeds into imposter syndrome. So for example, with memory, that is an executive function that is impacted by ADHD. If you can't remember the things that have gone well or when you have felt competent, then that's going to affect self-esteem. And then when imposter syndrome says, hey, you're really rubbish, then you're like, oh, actually, I kind of remember when I am doing well. So that doesn't help. Also, with executive function challenges, often our intentions don't always match our actions. So that also feeds into imposter syndrome. In my previous job, I'd always get called out for attention to detail, no matter how hard I tried. So actually, if you struggle to execute things that you want to do, then it makes you feel incompetent. And then when imposter syndrome's like, hey, you're a fraud, you're like, well, you did make that mistake last week. Super challenging. And also ADHD generally affects self-awareness, and that can include self-awareness of what you're good at and things like that. There's also the added layer of self-esteem issues with ADHD. So I'll know the statistic that people with ADHD get 20,000 pieces more criticism than their neurotypical counterparts under the age of 12. So that means that things like getting your PE kit and things like that generally add to a sense of comparing yourself to others as well. Imposter syndrome is very happy about that, because if objectively you feel like you're making more mistakes than other people, it's easy to forget all the good things that you're doing, and imposter syndrome is super common with people with ADHD. The good thing is once you're aware of it, that's kind of, part one of realizing that if you do feel like you're an imposter and you're a fraud, you can kind of, when those thoughts come up, say, that is the imposter syndrome talking. How you can counteract imposter syndrome is collecting evidence. So when a project goes well and someone says something to you like, oh my God, that was an amazing job, you had such great ideas, write that down. Put that in a folder, create a smile file. This is a tactic on extra focus, which is a book that I've read recently. Save the positive emails, take screenshot of the team's messages, ask people for feedback and testimonials if you work for yourself, and generally just collect evidence, so that then when imposter syndrome says you're actually really rubbish, I can be like, there is a certificate that I have here which says that I did a creative course that was really hard to get into, so I am creative. Or actually, one of my clients literally said to me in a session last week that she's found it really helpful. And so if you can create cold hard evidence that you have done things that are hard, you're good at your job. And often in employer situations, no news is actually good news. And that's really hard to deal with, because especially if you're a people pleaser, you need a constant reassurance. Whereas actually, if you think about a situation at work where someone hasn't been doing a good job, they're often picked up on straight away. So you may not be getting praise all the time, but that doesn't mean that you're not doing a good job. Another thing is practice compassion. And by that, I don't mean just be nice to yourself, but acknowledge the feelings, write down lists of things that you've done which you're proud of. That is practicing compassion. Give yourself grace when you do feel imposter syndrome and acknowledge that it's there. Be like, hey, it's okay to be nervous about a big presentation because you care about it. And generally creating time for that self-compassion, and whether that is writing down things that have gone well so that you've got evidence that you are good at your job, and recording achievements, and also getting that external evidence as well, so that your boss said that in your last review you were performing well, etc. Another thing for imposter syndrome is actually setting realistic goals. So if you set yourself up for failure and then you fail, imposter syndrome is going to say, sure, of course you couldn't do that. Whereas actually, if you set teeny tiny achievable goals within your day, like creating a video, which is my goal for today, which actually is quite a big goal because there's a lot of steps involved, but basically by breaking down tasks into smaller steps that are achievable, then that is helpful when dealing with imposter syndrome, because you're not setting yourself up for failure and you're not feeding into that you're not good enough if the goals are too high. Another thing is challenging perfectionism, so looking at the standards that you hold yourself objectively compared to other people, trying to give yourself permission to do a B grade job sometimes, and also just like if you have unhelpful things like this isn't as good as so and so's work. Question, is that helpful? What is helpful? Actually, what's helpful is to have a glass of water, take a break from the project, do something else, think about a project that has gone well. So by challenging when imposter syndrome comes in, by saying things like, hey, there's the imposter syndrome, and actually I am nervous because it's a big project, is okay. Another thing is actively asking for feedback. So I used to be terrified of feedback, and I basically forced myself to get more feedback. So I asked my boss for feedback in our weekly one-on-ones so that there wasn't a scary annual review. So this is kind of an imposter syndrome RSD thing, but basically actively seeking out more opportunities for feedback can help you to practice dealing with feedback. And also often with imposter syndrome, if you're not getting any feedback, or assuming you're doing a terrible job, whereas actually if you ask for more feedback, you can see specifically the areas that you're improving on and also specifically areas where you're doing well. But yeah, that's kind of the general overview of imposter syndrome. Let me know if you've got any questions about imposter syndrome, but it is really hard, and sitting with just praise and things like that is also really hard. So try and write it down, write the lists, use that overthinking exercise and things like that, so that you can basically look at the evidence for you being okay at your job, or the evidence against you being okay at your job, and look at the cold hard facts and see what it is. And also have people that you can talk to about it. Do not suffer in silence. If you've got a friend outside of work that you can text or send voice notes to, that's awesome. Or if you've got a work wife or work ally that you can send a message to and say, actually, I'm really nervous about that project, or can you just look at this before I send it over to so and so, because I'm not sure if it's rubbish or if that's the imposter syndrome speaking. So it's always good to have a friend option, and be kind to yourself, because working is hard. Having ADHD can be super challenging, especially when the imposter syndrome chatter is loud, but it is possible by building that evidence and practicing self-compassion and practicing seeing the positive and things like that can really help. But yeah, I will speak to you soon. Bye.